In a previous lecture, I ended things off by talking about the key attribute. It's recommended that you add it to the element that you're looping through. I wasn't completely apparent why you would want to add it. In this lecture, I want to provide absolute clarity as to the reason why you would want to use the key attribute. The main reason is that it'll prevent strange behavior from happening. Let's first look at the problem. Then, we'll see how the key attribute solves that problem. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with the files you'll need. Download it, unzip the contents, and point your editor to those files. Pause the video if you need to. Inside the template, we have a div tag with the class card. There's a header and paragraph where the header will contain the name, and the paragraph will contain a message. We'll be looping through this element in a moment. Inside the JavaScript file, I have initialized a Vue instance. Inside the data property, I have a list of people with their names and a message. As for the CSS, I've added a bit more CSS than usual. Nothing in here is related to Vue, but I decided to add more visual information so that things are clearer for this lecture. Alright, let's begin working on the application. It's going to be simple. All I want to do is loop through the people data array and render it onto the template. We'll need to use the v-for directive to loop through the data. Inside the template, we're going to apply the v-for directive to the div tag with the class of card. The expression will be person in people. Next, we'll replace the static text with their respective expressions. The heading will be person.name, and the paragraph will be person.message. We're not going to apply the key attribute yet. Right above the list of people, we have a button. If clicked, I want to move the first person on the list to the bottom. Therefore, we're going to listen for an event using the @ character. The event to listen for is called click. The name of the method to run will be called move. This method doesn't exist, so let's create it. Back inside the Vue instance, we'll add the methods object. After adding it in, we'll define the move function. The move function will perform one simple task. It'll move the first item in the array to the end of the array. That's pretty simple to do. We'll create a variable called first and set it to this.people.shift. As you may know, the shift method will remove the first item in the array and then return that removed item. We can re-add the item by using the this.people.push method and pass in the first variable. This function is how we can move the first item of the array to the end. Let's refresh the page to see if it works. You should have something similar to me. The list of people gets outputted without a problem. If I were to click the button, the first person would move to the bottom of the list. I can click this as many times as I'd like, and everything will work as expected. Everything seems to be working fine. That's because we have a basic UI. Things can become more complicated the moment we add some interactive elements like an input. Let's see what happens if we were to add an input field. Back in the document, we're going to add an input field after the paragraph tag. We're not going to add any events, bind any attributes, or make it functional. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to leave it as an ordinary input field. Let's try testing things out again. We'll refresh the page one more time. Everything works as expected. If I press the button, then everything moves accordingly. Or so it seems. The first person is now Rick. Before I press the button, I'm going to fill in the input field for Rick randomly. If I press the button, you would expect the input to move with Rick, but that's not what happens. Rick moves to the last spot, but the input field doesn't. The text we had inside the input remained. It should have moved down below. Instead, the input now belongs to Amy. What's the problem? Vue is making a performance decision. It'll look at what's happening and decide the best way to approach this. For the most part, we've benefited from this. Vue will notice a change in the array, but it'll also notice that there are 3 items in the array and 3 items in the template. As I stated previously, Adding and removing elements from a template is a bit of a performance hit. Therefore, Vue will not move the elements in the template. It won't remove the element, nor will it add a new one afterward, just like we're doing in our JavaScript. Instead, it'll move the data around. What do I mean by this? Currently, the first element has the name, Amy. By pressing the button, Vue will not move the element. It will instead move the text itself to the bottom. Only the data is moving around, not the elements. That worked fine previously, but now we have a dilemma. Each card has an input that doesn't get moved. We want the input to move along with the data. The recommended solution is to use the key attribute. Let's try using that, and then I'll explain what's going on. Back inside the template, we're going to apply the key attribute to the card element and bind it. The value should be a unique value on each iteration. Typically, this would be an ID. At the moment, we don't have an ID, but the name is unique to each item in the array. We'll use that as an ID. We'll pass it in. Alright, let's see if this fixes things. I'll refresh the page once more and try moving things around. Everything works as before. We'll input something into John's card and move it around. Vue has not only moved the data, but it has also moved the input. It doesn't matter how many times I press the button. John will be moved appropriately along with the input. Alright, so what's going on this time? Vue will notice that you have a key attribute added to the element. This attribute tells Vue that the data belongs to this element. Therefore, everything inside this element is now related to the person it's displaying. Whenever the data gets updated, and the data has to move around, the elements will also move with it. Even if there's no data attached to the input field itself, since it's inside the element, it'll get moved as well. There are two ways that Vue will move things around. Without the key attribute, Vue will move the data around, but not the elements themselves. This process is what Vue calls patching. By adding the key attribute, we're forcing the elements to move. This process is more costly in terms of performance. However, the main benefit is that we don't have to worry about strange behavior. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to more information about keys for list rendering. The overall gist of this is that you should always use the key attribute. The only reason to not use a key is when the list is simple. However, once you start introducing animations, forms, and components into the mix, the key attribute will be a lifesaver. It'll relieve you of many headaches. I always recommend you use it. If you ever experience any elements not behaving the way you expect them to inside a loop, try to check if the key attribute is applied. If not, then add it in and see if that solves your problem. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one.